Obrigada, professores. Agora, daremos início à mesa redonda, que será ministrada pelo professor Vaughan Macefield. Now, we will start the round table by PhD Vaughan Macefield. I would like to invite PhD Antônio Cláudio Lucas da Nóbrega to minister his talk.
Bom, gente, passando imediatamente para a palestra do Vaughan Macefield, alguns de vocês conhecem, mas o Vaughan é uma liderança extremamente ativa na produção de conhecimentos sobre atividade simpática relacionada ao exercício, imaginamento cerebral, uma pessoa extremamente colaborativa, já esteve aqui no Brasil, conosco em outros eventos, colabora com vários colegas pelo mundo afora. Ele originalmente, apesar de ter nascido na Inglaterra, ele na verdade cresceu na Austrália, já foi pró-reitor de pesquisa na Universidade de West Sydney e hoje ele está em Dubai, aceitou o desafio de ir para Dubai e fundar e ser coordenador de pesquisa lá na universidade, fundar um laboratório. So, Vaughan, thank you so much for being here with us. I know your time is very precious and we're very honored to have accepted to be here. The stand is yours.
Thank you very much. First, I'd like to thank Professor Nóbrega for the very kind invitation and to thank Dr. Fernandez for his assistance in getting me over here. It's been a very difficult journey for me to get to Brazil. Various things have prevented me from getting here. Delighted to be here. And I assume, saying in Portuguese there, was all nice stuff. Anyway, so this is the School of Medicine at Western Sydney University, where I have my labs up here. But as you've heard, I've just moved to this new medical school in Dubai. So it's a brand new school. It's all very exciting. And many of you will recognize this building. That's where I live. I'm renting an apartment in that building. Cool, right? Sorry, I'm bragging now, but it's pretty nice. So, as most of you are aware, we can stick a microelectrode through the skin into a peripheral nerve and record various signals. For instance, muscle sympathetic nerve activity, which occurs as bursts of negative going spikes time locked to the ECG. Most people are just concerned with this signal, the integrated nerve or the RMS process nerve, but there's actually a lot of information in the raw nerve signal, and we've been doing a lot in processing that. For instance, using very highly selective microelectrodes, we can record from single sympathetic axons, and these are unmyelinated, they're a micron in diameter, and it's a matter of fine manipulation of the microelectrode to get close to one and only one axon. And like all single unit recordings, we superimpose the spikes, and if they've got a uniform morphology like this, then we can assume that we're recording from one and only one axon. I'm not going to talk about single unit recordings anymore, but just to emphasize the sort of quality of the recordings that one can obtain from awake subjects. You can also record from myelinated axons, right, muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organs, what have you. Anyway, I should say I changed the title. Notice that because I realized, I better put something in about exercise. So the first part will be on that. Anyway, so why are we interested in muscle sympathetic nerve activity in exercise? Can you hear me okay? Because I've got a bit deaf in this ear. I've been swimming in the beach in Dubai a lot. I've got all this water in here and it's not coming out. So as you're all no doubt aware, many studies have shown that muscle sympathetic nerve activity to non-contracting muscles not engaged in exercise, increases during a sustained isometric contraction. What is not understood is what happens to sympathetic outflow to a contracting muscle. Now, Gunnar Velin, in 1992, when he came to the lab in Sydney where I was studying, showed a decrease in muscle sympathetic nerve activity. And what they did there was they did bilateral recordings, both legs, and it was very difficult to isolate the nerve activity from the muscle that was contracting because of all the EMG infiltration of the signal. So what they did was applied spectral analysis. They looked at the spectral power of the nerve signal in the muscle that was contracting and compared it to the muscle that was not contracting. And I visited Gunnar at his summer house in July this year, and we were chatting amongst things, and he said he was never very happy with that conclusion, which delights me actually, because another group from Copenhagen showed, when they looked at the extensor digitorum brevis muscle, small muscle on top of the foot that lifts up the toes, and they chose that because the muscle's far away from the recording side, which is quite clever. They didn't find any change. Well, we've now, by definition, done the best experiment. This is the latest one, so by definition it has to be the best, until someone else disproves it. Hopefully they won't. So we showed that muscle sympathetic nerve activity actually increases to the contracting muscle. And so we just did recordings from the common peroneal nerve, the fibular head. We asked subjects to perform weak isometric dorsiflexions of the ankle, standard protocol. This is what we saw. So here's the raw nerve activity. It's on a pretty compressed time base, as you can see. We've got the force recording, the RMS processed EMG, is the raw EMG recorded over TA, ECG, and this is the nerve signal, the RMS processed nerve signal. So this activity represented as a mean voltage neurogram. Now it's very difficult to see what's going on there, because what you have when a muscle contracts, you've got a lot of things happening. You're activating motor axons down to the muscle, of course, which is why the skeletal muscle contracts. You're activating gamma motor neurons, and when the muscle is contracting, you're exciting Golgi tendon organs, you're exciting muscle spindles. So there's a lot of sensory activity going on here. And on top of all that, you've got problems with EMG infiltration from the contracting muscle. So, but what you can see, I hope you can, I can convince you here that the activity here during rest is composed of fairly small bursts, but during the contraction, even though there's a baseline shift, and so some of the signal is lost, right? We can still see that these bursts of activity are larger and more frequent during the contraction. And we found this to be very consistent, that unlike what had been shown previously, where this activity purportedly decreased or didn't change, we saw an increase. And this is shown here. This is force. So, of course, we couldn't go up to very strong forces because the stronger the contraction, the more EMG infiltrates the signal. But I think you can see that the total muscle sympathetic nerve activity increases in an essentially linear fashion with force. So here's the burst amplitude, burst frequency sort of plateaus, but overall there is an essentially linear increase in muscle sympathetic nerve activity to the contracting muscle. Now, does this make sense? I think it does, because we all know that when muscles are contracting, there are metabolites released, and they have a net vasodilatory effect on the muscle. So muscle blood flow increases to the contracting muscle. That's understood. And there's clearly functional sympatholisis, so the net vasoconstrictor drive is not having any effect, or maybe it is having an effect, in that it serves to temper the vasodilation. So it serves to control the amount of vasodilation that the metabolites are exerting on the blood vessels in the contracting muscle. We all know, of course, that muscle blood flow to non-exercising muscle decreases, so there's an increase in MSNA, and there's also an increase in splanchnic blood flow, vasoconstrictor drive rather, we assume, and the net effect is to increase blood pressure and to thereby increase perfusion pressure. That shouldn't be cutaneous. So how are these changes brought about? So, as you're all aware, there's central command. So we will our muscles to contract. And there are also reflex inputs from the contracting muscles. Now, I know you all know this. Now, the will to exercise obviously engages motor planning, motor execution areas of the primary motor cortex, cerebellum, and obviously upstream areas to the motor cortex. And these motor commands cause contraction of the extrafusal muscle. But there's also a parallel route, the so-called corollary discharge, which engages areas of the brain involved in autonomic control. And these are the areas that we don't fully understand, which lead to the sympathetically mediated increases in blood pressure and heart rate, and withdrawal of parasympathetic outflow to the heart by the vagus. So we did this simple study recently where I like running, so I had a camera and I was just running. First I started walking, just standing looking at the track. Then I started walking, then I started running. So it's a first person video. And then we got people in the lab, we put a microelectrode in, we recorded blood pressure, heart rate, respiration, and just sat them in front and they watched the video. And actually we saw that there were increases in muscle sympathetic nerve activity amplitude, burst amplitude, increases in heart rate, and increases in skin blood flow and breathing, but there was no sweating. Now these changes, they were very small, but nonetheless physiologically appropriate. They didn't need to sweat because there was no thermoregulatory demand, but the other changes are all appropriate physiological responses, albeit small. And this is shown here. So this is just standing, walking, and this is during observed running. So you can see that there's an increase in muscle sympathetic nerve activity. This is heart rate, skin blood flow, and this is respiration. So respiration increased even during walking, and no net change in skin nerve potential. Now, interestingly, this actually got quite a bit of media interest. And I had these stupid radio shows in Sydney calling me saying, Professor, we've got a whole bunch of fat guys sitting on the sofa watching sport on TV, saying that it's okay because they're going to get fitness benefits. I said, no, they're not. Anyway, so we also know that mental imagery without actual muscle activation can bring about cardiovascular adjustments. And Olympians, actually one of our medical students at West Sydney, she's an Olympian, she was a hurdler and then a bobsledder. And you may know that they actually practice all their routes and they develop motor strategies, so they're just imagining what they're going to do. And that improves cardiovascular fitness, it's believed. Anyway, so these cardiovascular changes can be observed in experimental whole body paralysis. So my colleague Simon Gandevia a few years ago, in the 90s, did this heroic experiment that some of you may be aware of. He curarized volunteers. So he infused curare, totally paralyzed them, they were on ventilators, but they had a sphygmomanometer cuff in the upper arm of one hand, one arm, so they could indicate, and they did various studies like increased CO2 to look at dyspnea, and whether subjects can report elevations in chemical drive to breathe, and they also looked at central drive. So basically they asked subjects to attempt to contract the paralyzed muscles. The muscles aren't contracting, of course, because of the curare, but what you can see here on a compressed time base are 3 attempts to contract the paralyzed leg muscles at different intensities. This is heart rate and blood pressure. And on an expanded time base, you can see that these changes occurred very rapidly. So clearly, you don't need reflex inputs from contracting muscles, right? Central command is enough. And this is much bigger than what we showed with first-person video. Because these are true attempts to contract the muscles at various intensities. However, we all know that reflex inputs from muscles do play a role. The accumulation of metabolites activates group 3 and group 4 afferents, especially group 4 afferents. And the so-called metaboreceptors, it's known that they project to nucleus tractus solitarius, the primary visceral receiving area of the medulla, which then feed excitatory axons to excitatory projections to the rostral ventral lateral medulla, which is the primary output nucleus for muscle sympathetic outflow. So we know that if you blow up a cuff immediately before the subject relaxes, you trap all the metabolites in, and you can keep that receptor activity going. And when you do that, you of course see this sustained activation of muscle sympathetic nerve activity. But this is a recording from a subject performing a 2 minutes of isometric contraction of the forearm. So they're just squeezing a pneumatic bulb here, and they're keeping it very, very constant. And then the cuff is inflated, and you can see that this increase, particularly towards the late stage of the contraction, is sustained. So here we just have central command with developing contributions from the metaboreceptors here, but here there's no central command and is just metaboreflex. So the evidence is that both central command and reflex inputs from the contracting muscle or previously contracted muscles can contribute to this sympathoexcitation to the non-contracting muscle. That's an important point. So, is the metaboreflex expressed in the contracting muscle? Now, I know, Laura, I said I wasn't going to tell you last night, you have to wait. So hands up, who thinks the metaboreflex is going to be expressed in the contracting muscle? It's not a trick question. Please don't put a hand up. Yeah. Cool. So, and if so, what would be the advantage of constricting blood vessels in a recently contracted muscle, which metabolites are actively acting directly on the vessels? So first, I'll come to this question shortly, but we did a study where we electrically excited the muscle. So we ignored central command. We're just causing electrical contractions of the muscle and attempting to record sympathetic outflow to that muscle and comparing it to a volitional contraction of comparable intensity, so essentially identical intensity. Now, this hasn't come up very well, but this is a voluntary contraction, expanded time base here. You can see down here the little asterisks are pointing to the negative going sympathetic spikes. On the left is a electrically evoked contraction, which produced a comparable level of force, but you can't see the neural activity at all when you look at the RMS process signal. It's totally swamped. What you can do, though, is expand that record, and you can see the electrical artifacts, and between the electrical artifacts, you can count the sympathetic spikes. You know, they're half a millisecond in duration. And I think you can see that if you look at the number of asterisks here, there are fewer than in this situation. So how did we really analyze this? Well, here's a recording from another subject, just a rest, and I just want to point out that these sympathetic spikes are in negative going action potentials. This is the RMS process signal, and we can just use the discriminator and generate standard pulses each time a spike occurs, and these are shown here. And then we can just look at the timing of the R waves here, and the timing of the spikes here, and generate R wave triggered histograms. Pretty straightforward. When we do that, we see, so time 0 is the R wave, and as we all know, there is about 1.225 second delay for the dominant burst of sympathetic activity, which is time locked to that R wave. So then we just put a little box around this area, and so these are the individual spikes, the timing of the individual spikes, and this is a cumulative sum, which represents the population discharge of muscle sympathetic nerve activity to the contracting muscle, and we can just count the number of spikes here. So we can use this approach during voluntary contractions, and importantly, during electrically evoked contractions, where other ways of analysis, means of analysis, would not work because the electrical artifacts just want the signal. What we found was that electrical contraction did not increase muscle sympathetic nerve activity. Voluntary contraction did. So most recently, and this hasn't been published yet, so a PhD student, Danny Bolton, has been working on this. He's just submitted his thesis. Very ambitious set of experiments, but anyway, we recorded muscle sympathetic nerve activity to the contracting muscle and to the non-contracting muscle. Subjects performed 4 minutes of isometric dorsiflexion of the ankle, followed by 6 minutes of post-exercise ischemia. And then we repeated these with ischemia present throughout. So we got them to contract while there was ischemia, and as well as post-contraction period. And the rationale there was to maximize the contribution of metaboreceptors to any change in MSNA. So this is what we expected to see, of course, and what we did see when we were looking at muscle sympathetic nerve activity to the contralateral muscle, to the non-exercising muscle. As expected, there's an increase in muscle sympathetic nerve activity during the contraction phase and during the period of post-exercise ischemia that is sustained. Nothing new there. This is what we see to the ipsilateral muscle. So there's an increase during the contraction, but during the period of post-exercise ischemia, it tends to come back towards the baseline. And if we performed this with ongoing ischemia, and interestingly, note that the increase in muscle sympathetic nerve activity to the contracting muscle occurs earlier than it does to the non-contracting muscle. So if we repeated this series with ongoing ischemia, shown in this line, then to the non-contracting muscle, the contralateral muscle, you can see that there's augmentation. So the metaboreflex is augmented because we're doing the contraction while the muscle is occluded, it's ischemic. So all metabolites are being trapped there. So that is augmented, as is the period of post-exercise ischemia. Now, if the metaboreflex was worth anything to the ipsilateral side, the contracting muscle, we would see this, but we don't. We see that. There's no metaboreflex. In fact, if anything, it's lower in the presence of ischemia. So if anything, it's tending to push it down. So, the metabolite reflex is absent to the contracting muscle. So reflex inputs don't affect MSNA for the contracting muscle. There's no augmentation of sympathetic outflow when the contraction is performed in the presence of ongoing ischemia. And there is no sustained increase in MSNA at the end of an ipsilateral contraction. No metabolite reflex. So this indicates that central command is exclusively responsible for the increase in sympathetic outflow to the contracting muscle, right? So you all got it correct. Very disappointed. I want to be able to go, aha, you're wrong. Anyway. So, now to the next part. Where does central command originate? So, we've been doing some brain imaging studies for the last nearly 10 years. And in this one, which was with Mikael Sander from Copenhagen when he visited the lab for 18 months, we did this brain imaging study. We asked subjects to perform 2 minutes of hand grip and then 6 minutes of post-exercise ischemia, just like you saw before. And so we used functional MRI, and we measured blood oxygen level dependent signal intensity, which is a proxy marker of neuronal activity. So using the same physiology protocol, we recorded muscle sympathetic nerve activity from the same subjects on a different day in the lab. So we had the neural activity recorded in the lab, and the brain activity recorded in the scanner. You've seen this image before, but basically it's just to emphasize that we're using the same pneumatic cuff, and subjects could hold this very, very well. So 40% of maximum pressure, and they could just squeeze that. And we're provided with visual feedback, and they can manage that quite well. Now, what happens in the brain when we do this? Well, you'd expect central command to increase, right? Because you're causing a contraction. And sure enough, if we look at the primary motor cortex, then we see that there's an increase in signal intensity, which essentially comes back towards baseline after the period of contraction. Likewise, there's an increase in signal intensity in the cerebellar cortex and the deep cerebellar nuclei. These are all involved in motor control. However, this is curious. The subjects, as you can see, were instructed to generate a constant level of pressure, and they did do that. So what we should have seen was this, or what we saw was that. Why? Well, we know that if you record the EMG from the forearm flexors, then there is an essentially linear increase in EMG required to maintain this force constant, because they're suffering from submaximal fatigue. So you need to recruit more motor neurons in order to keep that force constant. So that makes sense. So this is, we're really representing here is the neural correlates of central command, or at least the motor output from the primary motor cortex. We also saw other changes. So here's the primary motor cortex, the insular cortex, which increased and remained elevated during the period of post-exercise ischemia. And we saw areas here, the mid-cingulate cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex, which actually showed decreases in signal intensity. I'll come back to this. In the brainstem, when we looked at the medulla, we saw an increase during the contraction, but was maintained during the period of ischemia in the dorsomedial medulla and also in the lateral medulla. Now we argue that the lateral medulla, and I'll come back to this later, this location corresponds to the human homologue of RV11, the rostral-ventral medulla, and this corresponds to the human homologue of nucleus tractus solitarius. So this fits with the animal data, which says that the metaboreceptors project to the nucleus tractus solitarius, which then project to RVLM, which then increases muscle sympathetic nerve activity. So the increases in the insular cortex may reflect the increase in sensory input. As I said, there's a lot of sensory input, and actually it can be quite painful. And there's also an increase in sensory input from the baroreceptors. As blood pressure increases, and we know that the baroreceptors project to the insular cortex. The decrease in activity within the anterior cingulate and mid-cingulate cortex may be related to other aspects of the task, the affective elements. And we would argue that the increase in MSNA during the metabolite reflex is simply a reflex. So in the simplest form, all that is required is a projection to nucleus tractus solitarius and then to the rostral ventral medulla, which is not to say that the other areas aren't involved. But it becomes difficult when you're talking about, well, what is responsible for this? Is it just this reflex, or are there other areas involved? Are those areas involved in furnishing that response, or involved in other aspects of that response, such as the sensory and affective components? So then we wanted to ask the question, where is muscle sympathetic nerve activity generated at rest? We know that from animal work that if you remove the cortex, all you need, and the pons, all you need to maintain blood pressure constant is the medulla, right? And if you sever the cord below the medulla, blood pressure falls. So the medulla is critically important for homeostatic regulation of blood pressure through the baroreflex. So many brain imaging studies, of course, have been undertaken to understand the operation of the human autonomic nervous system. And like the hand grip protocol that we used, they use a maneuver that you can study in the lab as well as in the scanner. So you can do the nerve recordings in the lab, and another day you can do the brain imaging. But we wanted to ask, well, can you record muscle sympathetic nerve activity at the same time? And so by doing this, we've been able to identify areas of the central autonomic network involved in the generation of spontaneous bursts of muscle sympathetic nerve activity. And we've been exploring this in healthy subjects and also different pathophysiological states. And we refer to this as MSNA-coupled fMRI. So how did we do this? Well, it's a bit difficult because, you know, we've got a big magnetic field, 3T. You can't have any iron in there. But the microelectrodes are tungsten, the wires are copper, and the pins are gold. The only problem was normal, commercially available amplifiers aren't suitable. But so here are all the issues. And lots of artifacts, lots of noise. But this is the recording setup. We actually have the subjects on an MRI bed in the lab. We put the microelectrode in, and we record blood pressure, heart rate. We record resting activity for 10 minutes, and then we remove the blood pressure recording system and ECG, and we keep the electrode in. And then wheel the subject or the patient around to the scanner and hope that the electrode hasn't fallen out. Because as soon as we get to the scanner, the meter is running, and you know we have a 2-hour session, and it's like $1,500. And if it doesn't work, it's gone. So anyway, what you can see here is a subject about to go into the scanner. You can't see here, but here's the lead, the head stage. And if we have a close-up, this is the stainless steel head stage, the neuro amp. This is high-grade stainless steel, so it can't be magnetized. So when I first wanted to try this, I thought, this would be really cool to do this, right? 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Okay, actually 10 minutes? Don't worry. Starting now. So when I wanted to do this, I thought, well, could this work? So I took this head stage round to the MRI machine and I asked the radiographer just to hold it in front. Now, if it was magnetizable, it'd go in like that, and it didn't, so that was great. And so the next day, I got a subject and I put microelectrodes not into a nerve, but into tibialis anterior, and just asked him to do some dorsiflections, and we could record the EMG. So the day after, I think it was the day after, we stuck it in the nerve. And this was the first recording, and we've got scanning artifacts, and I'll come back to the protocol. We use a sparse sampling protocol where we scan for 4 seconds, off for 4 seconds, on for 4 seconds, off, so on. 200 volumes takes about half an hour. And we were looking at this thinking, oh geez, we could hear it, I think there's a burst there, but all this noise. And then we did what all neurophysiologists do, we applied some digital filtering. We just added a high-pass 300 Hertz filter. The same record now with a high-pass filter. And look, the background noise is coming right down. And here are 2 cute little bursts of muscle-symbolic nerve activity. Very cute. Here's another example, again, with, so this is an overt burst. And we can, after filtering, we can measure that burst amplitude. And through this approach, where we scan for 4 seconds and record for 4 seconds, scan for 4 seconds, we're using the principle, well, the fact that the bulb signal is delayed. An electrical event in the brain precedes blood oxygen level dependent changes in signal intensity by about 5 seconds. So this burst was generated in the brain a second ago, because it takes a second to travel from the brain down to the peripheral recording site. But the electrical event in the brain appears 5 seconds later in the bulb signal. 5 minus 1 is 4 seconds. So basically all we're doing is looking at each 1 second epoch and looking at the corresponding epoch in the bulb signal. So basically we see when there are bursts present and when they're absent. We sum it all up, and this was the first study where we just wanted to concentrate on the brainstem. And this is one subject, and it's on a very compressed time base. But I think you can see the total muscle sympathetic nerve activity in black and the signal in this area here, which we proposed as the human homologue of the rostroventral medulla. They're essentially covariating. This, from another study, we showed that these 2 blobs are, we believe, the human homologue of the rostroventral medulla, because Andrew Allen and Fred Mendelsohn in Melbourne showed that the RVLM, the human RVLM, is displaced dorsolateral. This is identified with angiotensin II subdividing. Is displaced from its ventral position in the rat by these large inferior olives. So this is the human RVLM, the primary output nucleus for sympathetic activity. So using this, so we're not doing any maneuver. The subjects are just lying in the scanner and bursts are occurring spontaneously or not occurring. And when we analyze all the activity, we can see that there are 2 blobs, we refer to these as blobs, quite endearing really. 2 blobs of activity when there are bursts present, so an increase in signal intensity and decreases in these areas that correspond to the caudal ventral lateral medulla. And this area here, nucleus tractus solitarius, and this more caudal area, which fits with the caudal pressor area. So if we just look at the RVLM, when there are bursts present, signal is high in red, and when there are bursts absent, signal is low in blue. And if we look at caudal ventrolateral medulla, the obverse is true. So that rhymes too. So when bursts are absent, the signal is high, and when bursts are present, the signal is low. So basically, this is representing the flip-flop that occurs between caudal ventrolateral medulla and rostral ventrolateral medulla, because the baroreceptors project to nucleus tractus solitarius. Go to this. Oops. Baroreceptors project to nucleus tractus solitarius, which then project to caudal ventrolateral medulla, which then send inhibitory projections to alveoli. So when blood pressure is low, signal here is low, so signal here is low, therefore RVLM is allowed to generate bursts, and the opposite occurs when blood pressure is high. So that's the fluctuation of muscle-related nerve activity according to the, as a function of baroreflex. We also did cortical imaging, and these areas just popped up. The areas that popped up included this area here. We had no idea what that meant. Precuneus, posterior cingulate cortex, and these nuclei within the hypothalamus, dorsomedial hypothalamus and ventromedial hypothalamus. And if we look at a cross-section here, we can see the anterior insula, cerebellar cortex, precuneus, a lot of activity here. And if we just look, if we zoom into the hypothalamus, we can see that there's bilateral activation in the ventromedial hypothalamus, but only unilateral activation of the dorsomedial hypothalamus. Now, are these functionally connected? Functionally connected? Yes, because we planted a seed in this area, and we tried to see which areas in the brain co-varied with each other. And that is shown here. So basically, we've got dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, precuneus, anterior insula, and ventromedial hypothalamus. And basically the same coupling is observed when we do coupling between RVLM and muscle-smooth nerve activity, or these areas in RVLM. So we're looking at the whole connectivity. Now, I won't have time to explore all these areas, but I just want to say that precuneus is interesting. No one's ever thought of it as having any cardiovascular role. Precuneus is the most metabolically active part of the brain. It's high when you're awake, it's low when you're asleep. And we know that when you're asleep, muscle-simulated nerve activity goes down, as does blood pressure. We'd like to think that precuneus is providing some wakefulness drive. So when you're awake, this activity is high, and through these connections, it contributes to resting muscle-simulated nerve activity, and hence blood pressure, which is higher in the daytime state than in the nighttime asleep state. Anyway, I won't go through this text. However, I just want to touch on a series of studies that we've completed on obstructive sleep apnea. Now, here's an example of a patient with OSA. We've got the recording going, and this is in the lab. We then wheel them into the scanner and see this beautiful activity, right? We kept the recording as we should. Sometimes it doesn't work, but here's an example where we're recording this nerve activity in the scanner, and also at rest where we're in the lab, we also have blood pressure recordings. And if we look at this subject with sleep apnea compared to an age-matched healthy control, there's clearly much higher activity. So this is a state of sympathoexcitation, obstructive sleep apnea, as we all know. So we actually saw these same areas upregulated. And I'll skip through it, but basically, if we look at the healthy controls in white, age-matched controls, about 53 or so, compared to the patients with obstructive sleep apnea in grey, it's all pushed up. So there's more activity going on in these cortical regions. We then give them CPAP. Then give them CPAP and still good, right? We then give them CPAP, and this is compliant use, so they're on there 5.5 hours a night. We can see that their observations improve. So muscle nerve activity comes down after 6 months, and it stays down towards control values. So here's one patient before CPAP. So we got these same patients in. We started off with 22. We got them in 6 months later and 12 months later. Very difficult because they had to have a needle in them and go in the scanner again. But they got a free CPAP machine and they were very happy to comply. Basically what happens is those areas that were upregulated are now downregulated. So the CPAP works, and this is shown here. So healthy controls on the left, upregulated activity in these areas in subjects with OSA. Following 6 months of CPAP, reversal. We also saw similar changes in the brainstem. Actually, it was very surprising because in the brainstem, ball signal intensity goes down, not up in OSA. So, in the controls and in OSA, so here's OSA going down in RAFA, RVLM, and midbrain, and reversing with CPAP. Now, why should this be? 1 minute left. Okay, my final argument, which I hope you're going to buy. So RVLM, primary output nucleus, heaps of activity. You saw how much nerve activity was going there. So you'd think that the ball signal would be higher, right? Well, the ball signal is known to reflect synaptic events. So if you're getting more nerve activity from those nuclei, but the signal is lower, that may reflect withdrawal of active inhibition onto the nuclei. So at rest, most sympathetic nerve activity in healthy subjects is fairly low because the RVLM is actively inhibited. And in OSA, that active inhibition is withdrawn, so there's less synaptic events in the RVLM, so there's less ball signal. That's our interpretation, we're sticking to it. So, I won't read through all this, but I just want to talk about what we're currently doing. Just down here, we're currently looking at patients with renovascular hypertension, which is a great model because these have got high sympathetic outflow, but we can look at them after renal angioplasty. So, we improve renal blood flow, and MSNA, it's known, comes down, blood pressure comes down. And we're going to repeat these hand grip studies while recording the nerve activity to get a better handle on where the central drive is originating. And we're also using fMRI coupled MSNA in a high field MRI environment to try to improve the spatial resolution of the signals that we're recording. And here's one such example, recorded at the 70 scanner in Nottingham. So even in a very high field, the NeuroAmp works, and we can get nice nerve signals. And that's the end of the story. Thank you very much. I just want to point out, Danny Bolton's just submitted his thesis. Dr. Chloe Taylor, who's from Liverpool, John Moores, joined the university. So it's Professor Simon Green, who came from New Zealand. And Rani Fatula, Linda Lundblad, Eli Hammer, all worked on this OSA with Luke Anderson, Paul Macy, and Dave McKenzie. Thank you very much.